Welcome to Northlandia, a place to bring a curiosity because here you'll find curiosities. I'm Wyatt Buckner of the Duluth News Tribune. Now I'll be your guide as we discover the unique and fascinating stories here in the Northland. Here we celebrate the region's distinctive people, places, and history. In this episode, we look at the 125-year-old sailing ship that had a brief but impactful stay in the port of Duluth. Let's venture forth into Northlandia. Here to share with us the past and future of Duluth's former schooner, the Victory Chimes, is News Tribune arts and entertainment reporter Jay Gabler. Jay, welcome back.
Thanks, Wyatt. Glad to be here with a story that isn't technically a Northlandia story, but has some pretty strong Northlandia elements to it.
Yes, this is one of the stories where it didn't quite make it into the column. You do lots of feature-y stories. You and Melinda, you guys do a lot of feature-y stories that kind of hit the fringes of Northlandia, and there's, I would definitely say, some overlap. Like we have a pretty routine schedule of when we have specific Northlandia stories, and sometimes you have stories that kind of in between there that easily could have been Northlandia. This is now one of them. So, Jay, first off, what is the Victory Chimes, and what's the backstory of it?
The Victory Chimes is a schooner, a wooden sailing ship. It was built in 1899 to 1900, right around there. I've seen both those dates, so I'm sure it takes a while to build a ship like that. So somewhere right around the very beginning of the 20th century, and was initially a cargo ship in the Chesapeake Bay, just a working ship carrying stuff around. Then went up to Maine, became a cruise ship there, and made its way to Duluth finally in 1986, and was just here for over a year before leaving again.
So before we get more into the story of the Victory Chimes, how did this come onto your radar?
This story came onto my radar after we received an email from a guy who has definitely been mentioned on this podcast before, Paul Von Gertz, who is a man who lives in Knife River, associated with a lot of maritime preservation projects there and railroad depot preservation projects, and is just generally a guy who's very fascinated with history. And he pointed out that there was this ship, the Victory Chimes, that used to be a Duluth ship, very briefly, but it happened. And there's some news with this ship, he pointed out, and I looked this up and found out that this is true. The ship has recently changed ownership, and the Victory Chimes, the ship we're talking about, is now slated to become a floating restaurant in New York City. So that's why this wasn't actually a Northlandia feature. It was a news feature because there is news about the Victory Chimes. It has moved to New York City for a sort of retirement, since it is no longer going to be a active cruising ship moving around for excursions. It's going to be, it seems, permanently moored somewhere in New York City, where you will be able to apparently step onto the ship sometime soon and enjoy a cocktail, maybe an oyster.
That would be pretty unique experience, I'd say, especially, we don't really have that necessarily in Duluth.
Yeah. The irony is that the guy who brought this ship to Duluth, his name was Jerry Juby. He died in 2006, and he had tried for a decade to bring a tall ship to Duluth permanently. His vision was that Duluth should have its own tall ship that is here all the time, that goes on excursions, that is, as people at the time hoped would become, as iconic to Duluth as the Aerial Lift Bridge or Glensheen Mansion. And so he had been trying from the mid-70s all the way up until the mid-80s to get a ship here in Duluth. And the irony is that one of the ventures that he decided not to be associated with was a group of business people who wanted to bring a tall ship to Duluth, but what they wanted to do was turn it into a parked, docked, floating restaurant. And Jerry Juby was like, no, that was not his vision. He wanted a schooner that was going to be active, or a wooden sailing ship that was going to be active and take people for excursions around the harbor. And he did realize that dream, if only for a matter of months.
Mm-hmm. So how did the ship end up coming to Duluth, and why didn't it stay long? What happened to this dream, this vision that seemed to unravel? And I don't know, that seems like the journey to how we even got here, because I know in your article, reading it, you included a YouTube link to an old news story that I would presume was made by the local news organizations, like reporting on the schooner itself. And it sounds like there was some pushback to it leaving the Chesapeake Bay and coming to here in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. When the ship was out on the East Coast, that news report was from the mid-'80s when the ship was visiting the Chesapeake Bay, and it made news there because the Chesapeake Bay knew that that was where the Victory Chimes was from originally, so it's sort of a homecoming, that it was hanging out in the Chesapeake for a while. And so they had a reporter go and, hang out on the ship for a little while, and the reporter talked to one of the sailors who said, well, I don't know what I think about, I'm paraphrasing here, but, you get the idea. This sailor was like, I don't know what I think about this ship going to Duluth. The fresh water is not as preservative like salt water is. It's not going to be good for the hull, which is a thing. I don't, need to get too deep into the, so to speak, into the, chemistry of wooden hull preservation, but it is true that saltwater is generally regarded as better for a wooden hull than fresh water. But that was tough. Jerry Juby had bought the ship and was going to bring it to Duluth, but the thing is that it was expensive to start with to buy a ship like this, even in the mid 80s, even after it wasn't as old as it is now. But so he paid that money, and unfortunately for this businessman, shortly after he bought the ship, it actually sustained some storm damage, got in some weather back on the East Coast before he even came here, and then so he had to pay for those repairs. The ship was now his, so he was liable for those costs. So that was a hit. And then it turned out to be incredibly expensive just to get this ship through the St. Lawrence Seaway, through the Great Lakes to come here, because the ship has sails, but you can't just count on sails to get a ship like this all the way through the winding St. Lawrence Seaway and down through to Duluth. So you had to have a tug, and there's a crew. And so it ended up costing over $100,000 in today's inflation-adjusted dollars just to get the ship to Duluth. So we have these great photos that I found. The News Tribune was all over it. There wouldn't have been drones in the 80s, but they must have sent someone up in a helicopter or a plane or something, because there are even aerial shots that the newspaper got of the ship coming into the ship canal and under the lift bridge, in 1986, and crowds just absolutely lined the piers. Duluth was so psyched to have this ship here, but basically as soon as the ship got here, Jerry Juby was like, "Thank you, glad to have the ship here. I'm broke." He wasn't actually broke, but was like, I am spent a lot more on this than I had planned to, and I do not know if I'm going to be able to keep it here. And, Mayor Fido, who was the mayor at the time, was, very happy, declared it Jerry Juby Day, everybody was psyched about it, but also made clear, listen, the city of Duluth can't just buy this ship from you. The city of Duluth was already in the process of making the William A. Irvin, the retired Laker, a permanent attraction, as it still is to this day in Minnesota Slip. So the theory was that, Victory Chimes was basically going to park behind where the Irvin is now in Minnesota Slip. That was going to be the thought. And so the city was already spending all this money to renovate the Slip, to get ready for the Irvin to come in. And they just, this is the mid 80s too. Duluth was not rolling in it. So they were just like, well, we can't help you out here. So it became clear pretty quickly that Jerry Juby was not going to be able to retain ownership of the Victory Chimes. And in fact, Norwest Bank, which is going to be a throwback for some of our listeners who remember before that bank merged with Wells Fargo, and that's what we now know as Wells Fargo. But anyway, Norwest Bank foreclosed on the mortgage and ended up selling the ship. So it ended up staying in Duluth for just over 1 year.
So then what came of it after that?
This is where, the story is kind of already, a little wild. Mm-hmm. There's already been some dramatic twists in the saga of the Victory Chimes, but it gets crazier because the buyer, when the bank sold the ship after taking possession in the foreclosure, was, wait for it, Domino's Pizza. The pizza chain bought the Victory Chimes and renamed it. This was, in retrospect, a really poor name choice because it kind of didn't augur well for the ship's future, but they renamed the ship the Domino Effect. So you may be wondering.
Please tell me someone delivered a pizza with the domino effect. I'm guessing not. But.
That might have been a better business plan, that you could, for some premium charge, get your pizza, delivered by a wooden schooner. What they had planned to do instead was to make it an attraction. They had a corporate retreat at Drummond Island, which is an island in Lake Huron. And so that was going to be the thought. They were going to move it to Lake Huron. But that plan ran into trouble because they would have needed to dredge a harbor to make more room for the ship. And so there was some local opposition around Drummond Island, around the work and environmental impacts, all that stuff. So that didn't happen. And then there was a tragic accident where one of the ship's masts actually broke and a crew member was killed. So the Domino's era of the Victory Chimes, aka the Domino Effect, did not last long either. And it was sold again. And what ended up happening, it went back to Maine, where it had been, successfully sailing before, and that's where it went back to. And so it goes back to Maine and spends decades there. And during that time, Maine kind of embraces it. I talked to Sam Sikkema, who was one of the people who sailed the ship and actually was its most recent owner before it was sold to its current New York owners. And he talked about how this ship kind of was embraced by the people of Maine.
And a lot of people really identify Victory Chimes as a ship that's from Maine, which is funny because she's not, obviously. Chesapeake Bay vessel, but Yeah, she was the largest schooner sailing in the United States. And, that in of itself, just the size of it, it's, quite a spectacle to watch sailing around. So I think it was, a lot of people did view it as iconic to the coast of Maine.
So during that period when the ship was back in Maine, it actually got some historic designations. It was featured on, do you collect the commemorative state quarters back in 2003? Remember that?
Oh, yeah. I didn't have a collection myself, but I remember them enough to know that was a thing that was going on at the time.
Oh, yeah. My grandma, whenever a new crop would come out, she would go to the bank and she would get two versions of each state quarter to give to, each of her grandchildren. So we were supposed to save them. And of course, I just spent them. I wish I'd saved them now, because then I could have had one to photograph. The Maine commemorative state quarter actually had the Victory Chimes on it back in 2003. So that was how important this ship was to Maine. So anyway, Sam Sycamore ended up also being foreclosed on. He also kind of saw it coming, and the issue there was it just, it's expensive to maintain a ship like that. He had a successful business, doing sort of excursions around Maine. But he said that what was kind of the last straw for him, besides all the, pandemic challenges, which, we all know about how hard that was for everyone. But he said he lost the ability to have a place when the ship needed repairs, which it does. It's a, century plus old wooden sailing ship. He lost the ability to have it pulled up for repairs locally there in Maine. So that would have meant that he would have had to sail it somewhere else to get repairs done. And then the, cost and lost revenue and all of that just made it no longer a viable proposition for him. So he lost the ship, and it has now been purchased by a pair of brothers. Yet more colorful characters come into this story. These brothers named Miles and Alex Pincus, and they are a pair of entrepreneurs in New York City. And their thing is they take these sailing ships and they turn them into floating restaurants. There's some pictures in the article on the News Tribune of another ship they've converted this way, and it does look fun. And, I've read interviews with these brothers. I didn't get to talk to them, but they basically said, what they realized is people love hanging out on beautiful ships like this. And man, as an owner of the ship, it is a lot cheaper and easier if it just doesn't go anywhere. You basically have the ship just permanently docked. You set it up. It's, it's an oyster bar. It's a bar. It's a, restaurant or whatever. And it doesn't need to sail anywhere. Everybody just comes on the ship, has their drinks, whatever, looks at the skyline, then gets off the ship. And that's just, a much easier business model. So that is basically what's happening to the Victory Chimes. I did have an email exchange with a representative of their hospitality business, Crew. And their rep said that they do not yet know where the Victory Chimes is going to end up permanently, but the presumption is that it will be somewhere in New York City. Most recently, New York media reports have spotted it at Pier 25 in Hudson River Park. So somewhere it's going to end up in New York, and Duluthians who remember the Victory Chimes will be able to go and toast to its Northland history on its deck.
Did they say anything about like a hopeful timeline of when they'll have it up and running?
No, I don't think they're ready to commit to that. The restaurant business, these things can take a long time, but I mean,
or it can happen really fast. It seems kind of in flux, new restaurants. It can either happen really fast or a prolonged period of uncertainty.
I know. I've signed up for their mailing list, and I hope it happens fast, even though being here in Duluth, it's not like I can quickly run and check out, the restaurant once they open it up. But I hope it happens fast because I'm on their mailing list now until we get news about what's happening to the Victory Chimes. And that means I'm subjected to multiple times a week these gorgeous emails with these amazing photos of these ships they maintain in New York and the food they're serving and the events and the parties they're happening. And I'm just my mouth is watering just looking at these images and the amazing food they're serving. So hopefully, Wyatt, you and I can get out to New York once this finally opens and take a look for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. To be clear, this podcast is not sponsored by Crew or their floating ship restaurants, unfortunately. But that does sound interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. But, in the meantime, Duluthians can actually see the ship in a sense, not the literal ship itself that is in New York, but the ship has remained kind of ubiquitous around Duluth ever since it was here in the 80s. And I think this is a big eye-opener for people who have been longtime Duluth residents when they saw this article that we published, because they recognized that there was a city logo that was the official City of Duluth logo from 1986 until 2007. And this logo, although it's been replaced by the new city logo, which you might know has kind of a little abstracted image of the hill and the hillside and the whatever, it's a little more complicated than the older city logo. The older city logo was just a stylized image of this tall ship. And I think people thought that, oh, it was just some like general image of a sailing ship that was turned into this City of Duluth logo. But in fact, it was a very literal, abstracted, but nonetheless, like it was meant to be a depiction of the Victory Chimes. And it was not a coincidence that this logo debuted in 1986, back when Duluth thought that the Victory Chimes was going to become a permanent fixture. It wasn't, but that logo stuck around for over 20 years. And it lives on to this day in the DTA logo. If you ever see a bus in Duluth, a city bus, including the very newest ones they just commissioned, darn it if there isn't the Victory Chimes on those buses.
See, that's an example where I have to raise my hand and be like, yep, that was something that took me by surprise. And I read your article, wait, that's what that logo was? Because like there's even like some, I can't remember where, but I know I've seen it on some city, like I've seen that city logo like around town, like maybe on some structures or things that just haven't been quite updated, just there's not been a reason to. Like, so I've seen that logo, and like obviously now the DTA bus as well. Like that was one of those things that just took me by surprise. Of like definitely did not know that there was a direct connection to a specific ship.
Yeah, and the fact that logo has had as much staying power as it had, that it like remained Duluth's official logo for 2 full decades after the ship itself left Duluth, and that even now it lives on, in the DTA logo and other places, as you say, Wyatt, to me is kind of evidence of like Duluth's, what I called in the article, unrequited romance with like tall sailing ships, because Duluth loves a tall sailing ship. The Festival of Sail obviously has come here multiple times. Most recently was in Two Harbors, and people flock to see the tall ships come into Duluth. People were obsessed with the Victory Chimes when it was here, and I call it an unrequited romance because I think Duluthians love the idea that we're this seafaring town or a lake-faring town, with a connection to the sea, and that tall ships would be part of our sort of lore here. The reality was there was a time when you would have tall sailing ships that were an important part of commerce on the Great Lakes, but that era really was kind of long gone by the time Duluth started to make it in a big way as a city and had its big boom at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Already by then, it was the kind of freighters, more or less like we have today, right? They're not sailing ships. They're big, workhorse, steel-plated freighters, not quite as romantic as the tall sailing ships. I think Duluth loves the idea that we'd be associated with these tall sailing ships. But I mean, the reality is a freighter like the William A. Irwin is actually a much, much more representative kind of working ship to be an image of Duluth. But something about those sails,
People love the tall ships when they come to town. Was there any connection or correlation at all between the Victory Chimes and the eventual Festival of Sail? Or
to my knowledge, the Victory Chimes has never come back since 1987. Understanding how much work it was just to bring it here in the first place in 86, I understand why, it has not made a comeback. But Sam Sycama, who was recently the owner and, sailor captain of the Victory Chimes, has himself sailed into Duluth, he said, on multiple occasions, including during the Festival of Sail. And he actually told me that he saw the logos and the images of the Victory Chimes around Duluth and thought that was cool.
I've sailed into Duluth a number of times. I always remember seeing there's this picture of Victory Chimes. You see pictures of Victory Chimes around in Duluth, which I always thought was pretty cool. But that's one of the things that I, really like about a ship like that is that, it spans so much history and it connects people from all these different places together. Somebody feels instantly that, they have a connection to this thing because they saw it in, Duluth, 30 years ago.
Well, I have to say, Jay, talking about the Victory Chimes and hearing its story, I mean, I read your article, but talking and hearing about it, it really feels like this is a story that should have been directed by Steven Spielberg, like kind of like War Horse a little bit, where like we're following the story of this ship that's kind of made its way around the United States. It's just kind of going on this journey, moving between one cast of characters to another colorful cast of characters until circling back to now not New York.
Well, either Steven Spielberg or Christopher Guest, there is kind of that quality to this. It's kind of like this like community really making a very sincere, ambitious effort to, make this spectacle happen, but does not end up being sustainable. And, there's another whole story that we didn't even really talk about. There's the saga of the Victory Chimes sailing back out the Great Lakes in 1987 back out to the Chesapeake Bay and, the East Coast. And I actually traded some emails with a woman who still lives in Duluth and was part of that crew that sailed the Victory Chimes out of the Great Lakes when it was sold in 1987. And she actually helped explain, there was this photo that I found in our archives that I was having a hard time understanding because it shows a bunch of people wearing Victory Chimes 1987 crew t-shirts in front of a big sign that says, going home, something along those lines, and they're all having a champagne toast out of plastic cups because, Duluth, you're on the pier or whatever. And I'm like, well, this, my understanding, this is not a happy time for the Victory Chimes in Duluth because it was just about to leave. So why is everybody toasting? And so it turns out that they were basically toasting the ship's departure, that they knew that the ship was going to be leaving Duluth and they were going to be the ones who were going to be, embarking on this kind of epic voyage to take it back out to the East Coast. And so they were basically giving a farewell toast to Duluth. So I, won't get into it much more here, but I've heard there were some adventures had by the crew on that voyage away from Duluth. So maybe that's the next story. Maybe that'll actually be a Northlandia.
Or a Spielberg movie. One of the hopefully one of the two.
Hopefully.
All right, Jay. So last question for you. We already talked about how this didn't quite make into the Northlandia column, given the newsy here and now aspect of it. But why do you think it still fits in the realm of Northlandia? It's kind of like a temporary Northlandia citizen in a way that's now moved its way onto New York in a sense.
The ship is actually an honorary citizen of Duluth, unless the proclamation made by Mayor Fido in the 80s has somehow expired. But he named the ship an honorary citizen of Duluth. I think, to me, in terms of what makes this story distinctive for our region, clearly a lot of communities love these tall sailing ships, the romance of them, the beauty of them, the elegance of their design, their rich history. This is not unique at all to the Northland, but I think it speaks to the way that our corner of the Great Lakes, and it is the corner, right? We're right at the far west point of Lake Superior, really loves to claim this connection, not just to Lake Superior, which is epic enough, but now, thanks to the St. Lawrence Seaway, to the seas and the oceans beyond. I still have this amazing bumper sticker that I got when I was a kid in Duluth in the 80s, and it's has that sparkly effect that was common on stickers in the 80s, and it says, Duluth, Minnesota's world port. I just, this region just loves to, loves the romance of the idea that a ship can and often does sail into, the Salties come in, they will sail into our port here in the middle of Minnesota. Well, not the middle of Minnesota, but the edge of Minnesota, and have come from Europe or, Asia or wherever, right? That we have this connection to, bigger bodies of water and all the adventures that lie beyond. And the, attempt to get a tall ship here really, to me, was very emblematic of that that love that people in this region have for not just the high lake, which we have, but the high seas and the connections there. So it's cool that the Victory Chimes now, even though it only spent a year here in Duluth, is really part of this region's story and always will be as long as she stays afloat, which, knock on wood, I won't knock on wood because I don't know it'll mess up the mic.
You can do it once.
All right, here we go. Knock on wood. We'll stay afloat for a long time.
All right, Jay. Well, thank you so much for bringing this to us and sharing your story here on the Northlandia podcast. Before we wrap it up, though, we just wanted to talk briefly about how you're going to be going on some leave pretty soon here. So the listeners are going to take a little bit of a break from Jay, unfortunately, but he will be back. He will be back.
Yes, I'm sorry or you're welcome. I will be out for a few months on leave, but yes, I will be back at the News Tribune, back with the Northlandia crew and back on my regular arts and entertainment beat as of late April. Mm-hmm. So looking forward to listening to all the episodes that come out while I'm on leave, because I'm sure the awesome work of the Northlandia team will definitely continue.
Mm-hmm. And you'll hear Jay's voice once during that time. We did, for our 1-year anniversary of the podcast come March, we already recorded a 1-year anniversary with all the members of the Northlandia team, Jay, Jimmy Loverin, Terry Cotto, and we all talk about the past year of the podcast and our time covering stories in Northlandia. So look forward to that episode to hear Jay's voice once again before he comes back in full come end of April.
Thanks, Wyatt. Have a good one.
You as well. And thank you for joining us on this venture into Northlandia. To read the original story for Jay's article, follow the link in the episode description. To find all the entries of the Northlandia column as well as all the episodes of the podcast, visit duluthnewstribune.com/topics/Northlandia. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to support us, consider becoming a subscriber of the Duluth News Tribune at duluthnewstribune.com/subscribe. If you or someone you know has a unique story that you believe can have a place here in Northlandia, let us know by emailing northlandia@duluthnews.com. Join us again next week and discover the extraordinary stories that you just might miss. You're on the right place at the right time, ready to step off the bean path with no rush to return, here in Northlandia.